women's is on the left. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Mount has a long history of involvement with science issues in the Delta. As a professor at UC Davis, he started the Center for Watershed Sciences, which became home to lots of researchers working on the Delta. He was on the first iteration of the Delta Independent Science Board and eventually became its chair. And he has been a very public voice on science in the Delta and how to address its many problems. After 34 years of being a professor at UC Davis, he retired to help Ellen Hennick start the Water Policy Center at the Public Policy Institute of California. Today, he is a senior fellow there, focusing his efforts on trying to bridge science and policy. Today, he'll be talking about ecosystem water budgets. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeff Mount.
Wait, wasn't there a bet about whether I'd show up in the kayak? I'll be in it tomorrow. Thanks for coming for lunch, and those of you who are online listening to this. And the problem is I'm going to jump around, and I'm sure that the audio won't work very well. So today what I want to do is present to you an idea, and I hope there will be a robust discussion associated with it. It's directly relevant to stuff that's going on, particularly what's happening with the Water Resources Control Board and their water quality control plan in the Delta, and particularly what the rest of us call Phase 1, and now they've changed its name to something else. But this is a vote which will take place next month on the South.
Is this working better, this one? Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, don't talk too close to it.
Well, okay, it's good. All right. So as background to this, oh good, the lights are out now, you can all go to sleep. The background to this is about 3 years ago, we ended up with a very large contract with the EPA, with, again, support from a number of foundations, to take a look at the impact of drought in California, and to take advantage of the fact that we've had one of the most severe droughts in history, and I'll get into that in a second, and take a hard look at basically the response of government to that drought. So we have written a series of 10 articles about that, and in fact one was just released last month, actually that's the 11th on it, which was about institutional response to drought, and that one focused principally on climate change adaptation. I just gave that talk yesterday at the law school at UC Davis. But today what I want to do is focus on the managing of freshwater, and specifically the management of freshwater ecosystems, and the emphasis is going to be on drought. I'll get to that in a second, is why the emphasis is on drought. Partly it's an emphasis because that's what we had. That was our grant from EPA, was to take a hard look at that, but it also, we began to convince ourselves drought is the single most important thing to pay attention to. And then out of this emerged something that a number of the authors on this article had been kicking around for several decades, and that was the concept of a budget, an allocation of a budget of water for ecosystem management, and why that is a better approach than what we currently do. So I will get to all of that during this talk. So we just had this drought, and how quickly we all forgot. And that is one of the things that is one of the most challenging things. Droughts are actually easier in natural disaster management because floods live for a very short time. Fires are relatively short, and we forget them. The disaster memory half-life tends to be very short for them. Droughts are useful because they last for a long time, so that there becomes a great deal of awareness, and the probability of change, significant change, new legislation that one might appear occurs because droughts last years. And indeed, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in 2014 is probably the most significant legislation in water, at least in a generation, but maybe several generations. So extremely important as an example, and you were all grappling with that. But in this case, this is going to focus principally on the ecological consequences of drought and the difficulty in dealing with it, and again, a recommendation of a remedy. Now, again, this latest drought was a wonderful test case, and the talk I just gave yesterday and the paper we released last month focused on this drought because it was a drought of the future. We did a whole bunch of modeling work and took a look out to mid-century, and that is the drought we just saw, the 2012-2016 drought, with its extremely unusually high temperatures, is basically the model drought that we've developed for kind of the typical drought of 2040 to 2050. Why is that important? That's about the time that Sustainable Groundwater Management Act requires that we bring our groundwater basins into balance, and this is what we need to look toward, is these kinds of droughts, these unusually warm droughts. But on the biological side, I will argue, and there will be some in this room who will push back on it, but that drought, because of the way we've modified this system, is the major bottleneck ecologically, and why we need to take a hard look at it. So as the co-authors and I argue in this report that we did almost a year ago, so last November, this is why this is important. We have always been a place with droughts. We've always been a place where we've had extended warm and dry periods, although maybe not quite so warm as we just had. And that our native fishes in particular are well adapted to drought. They have an extraordinary range of adaptations. I'm just giving you 6 of them here. There are many more. And by the way, this was pretty interesting to pry all of this out of Peter Moyle as we were doing this. But basically we said, what are these adaptations to drought? You know, everything from anadromy to fecundity, long living. I mean, look at the suckers, for example, in Upper Klamath Lake. They live a really, really long time because they only get a few good years for spawning. Or split-tail, for example. They live a long time because they take advantage of those few good years for spawning. Tracking, this turns out changes in inflow to estuaries and tracking that. Think of smelt as an example of that. Long distance movement, of course, salmonids are famous for this, and then of course dispersal. All of these are a method of adaptation to droughts, which normally produce a bottleneck and a population's recover. But because of the way we have changed the system, the way we manage water and the modification of the landscape, the introduction of a large number of non-native species within this system, all of these conspire against the natural adaptations that exist to basically adapt to drought. And this is why droughts, the argument is, and the argument we make in this paper, droughts are the single most important bottleneck. So that as you are thinking about ecosystem planning for the future, step 1 has to be thinking about drought, how to mitigate drought, how to deal with drought, that is plan for, respond to, and recover from drought. And as you'll see here, I'll make the argument, we don't do that. We don't do that at all, even though we just had this big drought. The other thing that is useful about this report that we did a year ago is that we archived basically a series of case studies to try and illustrate how we will need to change to adapt to droughts for ecosystem management to the drought. And we came up with conclusions that very few people will disagree with. And I mean, those are always the best kind of conclusions to put in. And that is that what we're currently doing is not working. It is not working well. We have yet to arrest this steady decline in native fishes. We may have prevented some extinctions, but overall, if you take the work of Peter Moyle and others have done over the last few years, all the trends are bad. And so basically we've been unable to get that, and I'm arguing that drought, including warmer temperatures, are playing a major role in that. Our argument that we make in this by looking at these case studies is we need a much more flexible water allocation system. We live by setting what I call the set it and forget it model, and that is the State Board, Fish and Wildlife, the federal fish agencies. We set a series of minimum in-stream flow standards, and we assume that those will both be adhered to and are sufficient for preventing bad things from happening. And my argument is they're not. And of course, as we know, they were relaxed multiple times during the last drought. The other comment that we made within this is that what we found by these series of case studies is how limited planning for drought was in terms of the consequence of drought on the ecosystem scale. And this is because, again, we rely on this minimum in-stream flow, set it and forget it kind of approach that we have used so many times in the past. Yet that approach requires emergency ad hoc measures. Think of Fish and Wildlife and bucket brigades trying to get fish, whether it was up on the Scott River or on the Russian River, or emergency issues that have to come before the board, which only stoke controversy. And they produce unpredictable results, and we don't have any evidence that it really made that big a difference. This is something for those folks at Fish and Wildlife to think about. It's what good did you do? during all of that, and how do you test that? This turns out to be pretty important. Finally, the last part that we looked at in all of this, when we looked at these case studies, is how really rotten our water accounting system is here in the state, and our ability to basically determine what water we might even have available for environmental management was greatly limited. So that also made matters worse. Those case studies are useful. It is my understanding that Fish and Wildlife and the State Board, at least, are doing their own set of case studies from the drought, so that there is something that is archived about the drought. But right now, this is about it that's out there. So from the series of case studies, we came up with a series of recommendations. At the top of them is the one that's really the focus of this talk today, which is it's a PPIC style that, we'll go on and we'll have these monotonous droning policy analyses, and in each one of these there has to be a WTF, and this is it. And this is the notion of an ecosystem water budget. Now, this is something that has been around for quite some time. It is used to some extent in other places, such as Australia. In fact, we did a report 2 years ago that looked at how they're doing this in Victoria in particular. So it's not new, and one of our co-authors actually wrote about it in 1986. And that would be Brian Gray. Another of our co-authors has been advocating this for some time. That's Buzz Thompson from Stanford. And we wrote about it in a book back in 2011 as an idea. So it's not necessarily a new idea, but it's an idea that seems timely based on what we learned from the last drought. And the notion of an ecosystem water budget is that it's a defined quantity of water. This is extremely important, that it is, in fact, a budget of water. This is the thing that has to create assurances for people. This is a budget of water. We actually argue it should be done in a given at a watershed scale. That seems to be the best unit to be able to manage it. But it has to be flexibly managed, and it has to act like a priority water right. That it has to be clearly defined what its priority water right is, and it has to be clearly defined what the ecosystem goals and objectives are. You'll notice I didn't say single species and all that. We'll get to that in a second. So the concept, this is spelled out in much more detail in the article, and again, you can download this online at the PPIC Water Policy Center website. As an aside here, when we wrote this article, and some of you have certainly dealt with this before, we were much more prescriptive about what this would be, and it was, again, I was working with lawyers, and we sat down and we described exactly how this thing, and when we sent it out for review, and those of you who do not know the process we take at PPIC, we go through extensive peer review. So we do, the book we did back in 2011 had 44 reviewers, to give you an idea of the scale of reviews. So this one had about 11 reviewers, and the reviewers were very critical, not of the specific prescriptions we had, but that we were too prescriptive. And that gave us a theme. That gave us something to think about, is that these things probably have to be negotiated on a watershed by watershed basis, that if you're too prescriptive, too top-down, it is not likely to work. They need to be adapted locally. But here are the general aspects of what we think an ecosystem water budget would look like. First, it has to be integrated into the water rights system. Now, what I mean by that is you have to identify, if it's a budget, our goal, our thinking behind this is that it would function like a water right, that somebody could manage it like a water right, and we call it an ecosystem trustee. Somebody could manage it like a water right, so it needs to be integrated into the water rights system. Specifically, the amount of water, the places it can be used, how you're going to use, what beneficial use you're going to get from it, and of course its priority within the system. And that's key. And in fact, we can easily imagine how an ecosystem water budget, we can pick a random river, let's take the Tuolumne River as an example, how an ecosystem water budget on that river might step into the priority system. It is our view that, of course, at the minimum level, there has to be the highest priority. It has to act like a senior water right. But elements of that ecosystem water budget could be farther down the food chain in priority rights. And then what you need is a management structure with ecosystem trustees. This is the part that got such interesting feedback from people. Here was our complaint. Everybody's in charge and nobody is in charge of ecosystem management in this system that you guys are in. When you think about it, it's all these agencies who are either regulators or regulated or both in some cases. and nobody is actually in charge of the ecosystem, which means there's nobody to hang when things go poorly. And I'm a firm believer in having people to hang, that it creates a great motivation to not be hung. And so our argument is that you need to vest somebody in the responsibility to manage that ecosystem and the power to do it. And that's why we talk about it as something like a water right. And it doesn't have to be called a water right, but it needs to function like a water right. And that somebody needs to be in charge. We've gotten a lot of glorious pushback, as you can imagine, on that idea from some people, like, we won't mention any names, but Yuba County Water Agency comes to mind. They said, look, we manage that thing as an entity. All right, well, that's fine in our view. We still, it's our personal view that you should have somebody in charge of that. Again, because of the push and pull of various interests. So a good management structure for somebody who can do this. And then the key, and this is essential, and again, a biologist on this committee kept saying this again, and this authorship kept saying again and again, we need flexibility, the ability to respond to a heat spell, the ability to respond to good times as well as bad, some flexibility for being allocating that water. And of course, in our view, that meant treating it like a water right, and that is the ability to both store and trade water. What this does, and what it did in Australia where they set something like this up, is suddenly the environment moves from being a constraint on the system to being a partner on the system, that somebody sits at the table with the other water right holders and is managing that body of water for them, but also as a partner with the folks in the watershed. So trading and storage was extremely important, and management flexibility. And then finally, fix the budget. Make it a fixed budget. If you are, say, one of the three, let's go back to the Tuolumne as an example. I'm doing all this because Randy's in the room as much as anything else, but let's go back to the Tuolumne, where you have, three, MID, PID, and San Francisco. They need to know what the budget is going to be, that the water budget, this is creating assurances to the water user community that you're not going to continuously be asking for more water out of that system, but that you're going to set a budget, and that the ecosystem trustees have to manage that ecosystem to the best of their ability, whatever that ecosystem is supposed to be in a highly altered system, with a budget. Okay, so it's not open-ended. This I think is necessary for creating assurances for the water user community. So that's kind of key to this flexibly managed, traded, stored, functions like a water right was our argument. So just as an example, a hypothetical example here, think of the typical flow regime that we deal with on the tributaries to the delta in this system, where you have a series of, the natural flow regime within it has a series of attributes that occur within it. There's your initial wet up during the fall, there's the winter flood pulses, there's the spring snowmelt recession, and then the slow recession in the summer early fall base flows. That's that system, and that's what the organisms themselves are adapted to, is that variability, that natural variability, including year-to-year variability. But of course, we have a very, very different hydrology in this system now, superimposed on an extraordinarily altered landscape within it. And the idea behind an ecosystem water budget is that ecosystem trustee would be able to strategically allocate water on top of the existing flow, or trade it, or store it till the next year if they want to. This is part of the discussion we'll have at the end of this talk. And be able to make this natural variability, to restore elements of the natural variability which improve ecosystem function and condition. Notice I still haven't said single species anywhere in here, because I think this is one of the major problems, is the ecosystem water budget has to be managed for ecosystem function and condition rather than single life history stages of single species. And this is a big challenge, and oh, by the way, at PPIC, we're going to undertake that over the next year, what do you mean by that? What, if anything, is ecosystem-based management? So we're going to try and tackle that over the next year. But the problem is, nice idea, ecosystem budget, but you can't just say we're going to make a budget. So the water board, for example, if they go ahead and approve their phase 1 next month, they're talking about 40% of unimpaired flow for a set number of months, and that is essentially the beginning of the building blocks of a budget. but it's not clear it could be managed in the same way. In fact, they're very unclear on how it could be managed and what the structure for management would be and what it would look like. And those are things that have to be worked out in the future. And so our argument is you're going to need a tremendous amount of improvement of planning and preparation to be able to manage an ecosystem water budget, particularly when it comes to managing drought. I don't think I'm saying anything which is controversial by saying the state and the federal government did not do a good job of handling the ecosystem during the last drought. That, they were stuck with a series of unpleasant trade-offs. They hadn't anticipated some of these trade-offs and they hadn't prepared for them. And so it just stoked controversy and responses were ad hoc and late. I've been very critical in public over this over the years, making so many friends, all that. So we're very unkind to the state and federal government and how that was managed. And particularly, the most egregious example is the Bureau of Reclamation's management of Shasta Reservoir during all of this. Again, they shouldn't have been surprised by anything that happened there had they been actually preparing for warm droughts. But instead, they were surprised, and it involved a lot of ad hoc decision-making, which didn't do well for the resource they were managing, and of course made things much worse. So it's time to start doing some decent planning in all of this. And of course, what we saw is these delayed responses, reduced effectiveness, lots of controversy over water allocation. With or without these ecosystem water budgets, we as a state have got to make the investments in planning for the preparation for the management during and the recovery from drought. And this is something we say very, very strongly in this. So you need some decent planning tools, and we proposed 2 of them. And again, we stole this. We try to steal all good ideas and claim them as our own wherever we can. Actually, I had a dean who once said to me when I became chair of my department, he says, you have to remember the rule number 1 for a chair of a department is to accrue all credit and assign all blame. So we accrue all credit for this. And if you don't like it, we'll blame whoever we took it from. So top of the list is, you've seen this State Wildlife Action Plan. It's broad, it's general, it meets a federal criterion, but it's not a plan at this point. It's a list of stuff to do. It's not a plan. And we need plans that operate at the right scale, and our argument is it's the watershed scale. So let's go back to the Tuolumne River. The Tuolumne River needs a watershed scale plan. They're actually working on it. They've got some plans within it, but that is seeking an ecosystem-based plan, again, avoiding the single species approach, but a plan which anticipates severe drought, that is prepared for, responds to, and recovers from drought. Extremely important. Now, it turns out Eisenhower was right, plans are nothing and planning is everything, and so the planning process itself is extremely important. And what we were looking when we did a series of case studies outside of California and looked at it, it was the planning process, which was far more important than the actual plan itself. So what we suggested is to borrow something from Victoria, Australia, that they do, and these are called annual watering plans. And I love the name watering plans because that gives you like a hose sprinkling water on your ecosystem. But that's what they call them, annual watering plans. And the process of an annual water plan, and those of you who do this for a living are just dreading this concept for a good reason, because it's painfully difficult work. But they do a new plan every year within the context of their overall watershed plan. And in the dry season, in the late dry season, they actually develop their watering plan for the next year. And it is a series of contingencies. If this happens, we're going to do this. If it doesn't rain in January, we're going to do this. Well, it doesn't rain there in January, but if it doesn't rain in August, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And they set up essentially a matrix for the things they want to accomplish this coming year, depending on what type of year type it becomes. But that's part of the problem. We function on water year type here. The biology does not function on water year type. I don't think I'm telling you anything you don't know. The biology functions based on when it rains or when the snow falls or when it runs off, and it doesn't lump neatly into water year type. This process they showed of planning, doing these annual plans, annual watering plans, is an intense stakeholder engagement process, and it reduces surprise. And by reducing surprise, by everybody knowing, look, if it's this dry, these are the things we're going to do. So I'm just using our water year as an example. If we say in October what our plan is for things we're going to do in January and February if it's dry, it is already telegraphed what's going to happen. You don't make that as an ad hoc decision based on some exceedance probability that is announced in the press in March. Okay, this is what our plan is. This is the way we're going to go forward depending on hydrologic conditions. It really reduced controversy. Now, it didn't get rid of controversy. As many of you know, Australia is going through the same sort of political chaos that we've been going through here in the U.S., and it comes and goes, but it has reduced the amount of screaming and yelling, and of course their very famous book burning, which was we haven't burnt have you guys had a burning of the Delta Plan yet? I don't know, because the Australians did. You know, they took their original water plan and the farmers made a giant pile of them and lit them on fire. It was great. It was great press. That has stopped. Okay, so the screaming and yelling has not entirely stopped, but it is, by greatly reducing surprises for the water user community, makes it easier. And the argument is these watering plans were the key, and that really helped. The other is something I'm preaching to the choir when I get to this, is that when we looked at what they were doing as well, if they were doing what they're doing in Spain, for example, or are doing throughout the West, but not so much here in California, is better accounting practices. It sounds really boring, except to you. All of you in this room know this is extremely important and how much we're handicapped by poor water accounting systems. And this is accurate and timely information, and in particular about water use and water availability. So when you watch the state board struggle with the temporary urgency change permits, which were constantly coming in, and the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project, and the individual irrigation districts struggling with how to plan in the middle of this drought, and at the same time Fish and Wildlife and the federal fish agencies to trying to find their way forward, we were constantly handicapped by limited information on availability and use of water. So better accounting systems are extremely important. And again, good, transparent information reduces controversy and lawsuits. By the way, good, transparent information is extremely necessary. And there was also, of course, and this is just something I wanted to leave you something to chew on today also, it's really, we do, I'll be very blunt on this, and we were blunt on it before. We don't do a very good job of accounting for the type of water we have in this system, and that made things worse. So if you're going to improve your water accounting system, you better reform your current water accounting categories. And not at the top of the list is the woefully miscategorized environmental water. The way the Department of Water Resources, by the way, I'm not saying anything I haven't said to the DWR now at 3 different meetings. We've had long meetings about how this might be changed. We were very cranky about the way DWR ascribes water to the environment. And I can get into a long discussion of why this makes no sense, but I'm going to turn this into a more positive set of comments. The current use categories are very misleading. You know, so urban, ag, and environment. I mean, this is the now famous that you have all heard. The environment's taking half the water, but agriculture is using 80% of the water. Well, how can both possibly be true? Thank you, DWR, for that. And it is the way you categorize water, which produces some of these misperceptions. So we have suggested we need to rethink water. We recognize that water that achieves multiple purposes has to be described neatly. What's happened is we've tried to ascribe water into 3 categories: urban, ag, and environment. And that's a mistake. You need to recognize which water achieves multiple purposes across the board and start to quantify that, especially if you're going to have ecosystem water budgets. So we came up with our own system, and again, we stole some of this from elsewhere in the world, the way they categorize water, and have proposed that as part of that accounting system, and you're going to start talking about ecosystem water budgets, you need to identify what really is genuinely ecosystem water. That is, water which which is basically not available for economic use, but is meeting ecosystem objectives. And so what we did, thanks to Greg Gartrell, many of you in this room know Greg from years ago when he was with Contra Costa. He's the lead author on a second report related to this, and then we published something in the San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science Journal on this, where we said, look, there's really kind of 4 fates for inflow to the delta. So as water moves into the delta, it goes to one of 4 categories. It is either diverted, and that is from in-delta users, and we have a broad category of in-delta users, or exported, right? So it goes to economic uses. That's where some of the water goes. But a lot of the water, but no matter how many times you try to explain this to the average politician, their eyes glaze over. A great deal of water, in fact, during the drought, most of the water that left the delta goes to maintaining salinity in the delta, so that you can meet these standards, and this is to meet the ag and the M&I standards, the salinity standards in particular. But that same water, which is released, that flows out of the delta, which is described by some politicians as wasted to the sea, that water meets multiple objectives. Okay, so we call it system water, and that is the water you need to run that system. And that is both the ecosystem as well as the human uses, the human economic uses of that water. So that's system water. And then there is ecosystem water. And this is the reason we did this, is that we wanted to know what is the actual budget that goes to the ecosystem. And that ecosystem water is additional outflow on top of that system, that multi-benefit system water that goes out of the delta and into San Francisco Bay and creates a broad range of ecological benefits, both within the delta as well as outside of the delta in San Francisco Bay. And it is achieved in multiple ways. And this was the genius of the way Greg Gartrell looked at this. So, D1641, which you're all familiar with, and the biological opinions create various sources for water to flow out of the delta to meet ecosystem needs. And what DWR doesn't count is, for example, the amount of water that flows out of the delta due to pumping restrictions, which of course got much more stringent after 2008. So we quantified all that water that actually flows out of the delta because of ecosystem requirements and does nothing to meet the system requirements. So this is added on top of the system. And then there's the part that we don't talk about, and yet is extremely important in the system, and that's uncaptured water. That's water where you absolutely lack it's neither required by statute or regulation, nor is it water you could capture because you lack the capacity. So on a year like 2017, we had an immense amount of uncaptured water. But even in the height of the drought, where it was the worst case, 2014 is a good example, water year 2014, we still had at least 3 episodes where water flowed out of the delta that you couldn't capture, no matter what. There wasn't a federal requirement or state requirement that made it go out. You just didn't have the capacity to do it. So uncaptured water turns out to be extremely important to the system. And I want to go back. You can almost call this multi-purpose water, multi-benefit water. The reason is this uncaptured water freshens the delta. And by freshening the delta, it reduces the requirement to release flow from reservoirs to maintain delta salinities, which is what the projects made a bad deal about in the past. We can't change that. But basically, by them taking on the responsibility of maintaining salinities for M&I ag, as well as their own projects, they have to release a tremendous amount of water. In fact, as a side note, our calculations are that amount of water that's gone out has now gone up as much as 400 to 500,000 acre feet to maintain salinities in the delta, and we can have a long discussion about why that might be the case. In fact, I think this deserves a lot more inquiry about why it is that it's starting in the 90s. It took a lot more water to keep the delta fresh, and it's really by the 2000s it just had a big impact on that system. Anyways, that uncaptured water is extremely important because of the way it freshens the delta and reduces loads on the projects to basically keep the delta fresh. So as you might imagine, the way we have assigned this varies tremendously over the course of during a course of an individual year. Here's 2005 as an example. You can see the role of uncaptured water in that is quite large, in fact that's the big number in 2005 because 2005 was a relatively wet year. And you can see that ecosystem water is really only confined to a small part to the winter. And pretty much during the summer and the fall, ecosystem water was not that much of the budget. It also varies extensively between years. Normal years, that was 2005, was normal to above normal, but a normal year versus, say, dry years. During dry years, the ecosystem water, in particular as a proportion of water, is very small. It gets down to quite small, and I'll give you another example of that in a second. But you could see the differences between a wettish year and a dry year and how much of that is ecosystem water. What you do see there is the constant need for system water, which is that outflow of the delta to maintain salinity, to meet salinity standards. So we're arguing you need to start to peel apart what is the ecosystem budget if you're going to start trying to set ecosystem water budgets. And this is, again, you know, to this crowd, I can show these kind of diagrams, and you're not going to freak out. But the takeaway from this is, through a series of regulations. So, by the way, the D1485, as Greg Gartrell pointed out in D1485, we use striped bass as our primary ecological indicator, which the genius of that is it ensured that there would never be any interference with water export activities by using striped bass as the indicator. It was a marvelous design. You'll see how little our ecosystem water was actually allocated during that time. When we switched over to D1641 and then into the BIOPS, the 2008 BIOPS, no, the load of ecosystem water, as many people have pointed out, became much, much higher. Indeed, we can argue about how much it is, but it's on the order of around 1 million to 1.5 million acre feet of additional outflow is basically associated with the D1641 and the 2008 BIOPS. Now, having said that, I want to give you a caution. When you look at a given year, let's take 2006, where it looks like the ecosystem water it's a lot of water in there, even though you've got that huge amount of uncaptured flow. And that is because in a lot of cases, in wettish years like that, the ecosystem water objectives are met by excess flow in the system. So a lot of water in the system. So you cannot say that volume of ecosystem water is basically a transfer, in every year, is a transfer of water from an economic activity to the environment, because a lot of it is just simply meant by flow that's coming into the delta that cannot be captured. But we've listed that. When you get down to below average dry and critically dry years, that ecosystem water budget that we've calculated is an accurate reflection of what comes out of the eye of the water users. It is, and because in this case we've accounted for system water in all of this. But it has increased significantly. And so now all of a sudden we have an ecosystem water budget. Whether we know it or not, we've backed into an ecosystem water budget. And so here it is, basically from these, what the million acre feet that is allocated to these various parts of the budget are. And of course, what you'll see is we've got system water on this, and again, you can look at the one to look at is the bottom, D1641 in the post-2008 ESA, and you can see how much water is basically to meet system water objectives, that's to maintain salinities for human uses of the delta, and then how much is flow and water quality, and how much is from export pumping limits. So let's take a critically dry year. Average of critically dry years, 3.6 million acre feet of outflow has to go out of the delta to keep it fresh enough to use, and about 1.1 million acre feet is the ecological water. So that's much less than what you think you hear in the press on that. But those are important numbers, because suddenly you have a budget. I just described to you, you've got an existing budget with existing regulations. And why is this a better approach than what DWR currently does? As many of you know, DWR in their labyrinthine Excel spreadsheet that you can get from them, which describes how water is allocated and quantifies it, basically lumps outflow, any outflow requirements, whether it's to meet water quality or for ecosystems, is basically lumped into environmental water. And so publicly, that doesn't go so well, because that's when politicians who need to get a tagline out of that say, look at all that water wasted to the sea, because that's environmental water that's going out. I mean, that's just not true, particularly during a drought, since the overwhelming majority of that water is system water to basically keep it keep it fresh enough to be able to be used. So we broke that out and compared, and what we found by looking at DWR's approach is that, in fact, that part of their environmental water account really can be divided into system water and ecosystem water, but they actually fail to account for the water that is allowed to become outflow through pumping reductions. So ours is a much more accurate dividing of water, and we've talked extensively to DWR about changing their accounting practices. There's many other problems with the DWR accounting practices, not the least of which is in one of those years there's 2 million acre-feet of environmental water that when you look at is due to wild and scenic rivers in the San Joaquin system. What? No, and of course that's what happens. That's spill at New Don Pedro. They're basically, anything that spills at New Don Pedro, they're calling it environmental water. So it grossly inflates the amount of environmental water in that system. And then when you look at the North Coast, you know, the way you get to half the water going to the environment is because any wild and scenic, any molecule that flows down a wild and scenic river in the North Coast is called environmental water. We need a better water accounting system that more accurately reflects how water is used and its availability, and what we're proposing is you need to do that if you're going to do an ecosystem water budget. EWR has been very friendly about this. It's not, they're not hostile to this. These are a series of ongoing discussions, and they're perfectly willing to take a look at it. So Michael George walked in, and I'm not calling on you because you're late to class, but
you need a heckler.
I do know, well, yeah. No, stand in line, take a number, please. You heckled me enough over the last year, young man. Imagine Michael George was the ecosystem trustee and had a budget. Would he have managed it differently? And this is a good fundamental question. Would he have managed it differently during that? And again, those of you who are online, you can see 2014, there was this tiny, tiny sliver of ecosystem water. Now, if Michael could have moved some of that ecosystem water through, whether it was trading or in lieu trading would be the easiest bet, or if he could have arranged to have had it as stored water and carried over water into the next year and could have made a call on that water, he may well have been able to lessen some of the blow that came through in 2014 if he had had that ecosystem water available to him, but he doesn't. Instead, we have a series of minimum in-stream flow and a fairly rigid set of requirements for outflow as a proportion of inflow in the system, which doesn't allow you to respond. And of course, as we all know, in 2014, 2015, there were temporary urgency change permits, which changed the amount of water that was available for the ecosystem. So my argument here to you is that we need to rethink the way we do ecosystem water, and if Michael is the ecosystem trustee or there's somebody else is the ecosystem trustee, we're fairly agnostic on how that would be set up, they can be flexible. Most importantly, they can start trading and they can manage this water and start preparing for and responding to and recovering from drought for these ecosystems. So what does it take? What would it take? First, the most difficult is setting what ecosystem water budgets would be in, I will argue, in all the tributaries to the Delta. That's what it would take. Well, the state board is, in a way, backing into that as we speak. If the state board sets and use their unimpaired flow standard, that is the beginning of an ecosystem water budget, in my view. And that is the water that has to pass through that system to meet ecosystem objectives is the beginning of a budget. We can all have a long discussion about whether that is the right way to go, whether that's the right approach using an unimpaired flow standard, but the fact is it begins to identify what is a budget. And of course it varies based on water year type. It would be a complete mistake, in my view, to just simply make it a uniform standard all the way across. That wouldn't work. It's not effective. It has to change based on water year type. The second is, our argument is that you should be having a trustee for each watershed. So the Tuolumne needs a trustee, the Merced needs a trustee, the Stanislaus needs a trustee, the American River needs a trustee, the Yuba, the Bear, the Sacramento. We need a trustee for each one of them. Remember I said at the beginning, you need somebody to hang, but you have to give them the authority to get hung. I mean, to have action, to be able to take actions and coordinate actions. That is our view. There are lots of people who strongly disagree with that view. But to have some kind of trustee who's coordinated. Now, it might be that's, again, I'm picking on Michael because he's here and sitting in the front row for those who can't see on the internet. It may well be that the way to do this is have a trustee in each watershed and then have a Delta trustee, a single person in the trustee, or a group of trustees that manage the Delta and inflows to the Delta. And again, all of this, a trustee needs a plan. And they need two kinds of plan. They need a long-range plan for what they're trying to achieve, the objectives in that watershed, and they need an annual plan so that everybody knows what the heck's going to happen. If and when it happens, they need to know something. This is vetted with the stakeholder community, involves in them extensively. But to do this requires maybe the toughest thing possible, and that is regulatory agencies willing to take risks. It is far safer for somebody in the regulatory world, and you're here in this room, some of you are in this room, to do what we have always done, set minimum in-stream flow standards. But I'm telling you, it's not working. There is no evidence that it is working, and that simply working around the edges, well, if we just increase outflow of the Delta 500,000 acre-feet or something like that, is likely to produce positive results. We need a new approach. We've got to do something different. And so that my argument is this is the way to do it something different. And of course, because I'm here in the Delta Science program, you've got to have better accounting, and you really need a robust science program to support it. And without that, I think you're not going to do well. And we have some suggestions in this report on how we would do it. And the figure that I have up here is where water went during 2012, 2016. I wanted to send this to certain legislators, but I didn't think they would understand it. How much was really of that 8 million acre-feet outflow was wasted to the sea? It's just really important. How much of it was wasted to the sea? Well, it turns out more than half of what was wasted to the sea was just to keep it fresh enough so you could use the Delta. It wasn't wasted to the sea. It created ecosystem benefit, no doubt about it, by doing it. But it was for us to be able to use the Delta. Only about 18% of the water during the drought was basically wasted to the sea for the environment. Solely to the environment. That's important. That the amount of uncaptured water was far greater than the water which was actually set aside by regulations specifically for ecosystems. So the idea behind this is to get to a set of common facts that we can use and ultimately out of that build an ecosystem water budget. So let me conclude and then we can get into some discussion on this. I think we need an ecosystem water budget. By the way, it was originally an ecosystem water account, and that was a really bad idea because of the EWA, for those of you with a long memory. So ecosystem water budget, again, this is this flexibility and be able to flexibly manage it and create assurances to water users by making it a genuine budget. Planning absolutely has to be surrounded by a great deal of planning, very transparent planning and clear objectives, but not single species-based objectives. It must be ecosystem-based objectives. And without good accounting, you're not going to be able to, it would not be able to pass the smell test. We have to have a common understanding and we have to have a good test for that. I frankly think the Delta is the easiest place to do this of them all because of the known inflows to the Delta. You saw how we broke it up into 4 different water types. It was actually in many ways easy. It's harder to do upstream, but we have proposed that we actually try to do this throughout the watershed and to start to unpack the portions of the Tuolumne River which are basically system water, water for diversions, water for ecosystem, and uncaptured flow, and begin to back out of this so we know what our ecosystem budgets, existing ecosystem budgets are in these watersheds and how we might manage it differently. So I think that's absolutely critical. And with that, my finest picture of the Delta ecosystem I have, it's the Tuolumne River. With that, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we definitely have some time for some questions. Any in the room?
With climate change and seawater level going up, how do you propose the continued freshening of the Delta?
So right now that burden falls principally on the projects. So the projects have to meet M&I standards and ag standards and, of course, standards for the export pumps in the South Delta. They will be dealing with that in the consequences of increasing sea level rise. So that's kind of a foundation. I'm arguing that on top of that, you're going to be adding pulses, basically pulses of flow of fresh water through your ecosystem water budget. But you're right. Both of those point to greater difficulty to meet the existing water supply out of the Delta in the future. Yeah, and so I got to tell you, I said, I want to say this again, so you all register it, that when we tore apart the analysis all the way back to 1980, and we could try to look very hard at this using existing data, what we were struck by is how much more water it is taking now to meet these basic ag and M&I standards and export standards. And it is probably has cost, certainly in the last 10 to 15 years, a 500,000 acre feet per year. We're killing each other over less amounts in this system, and yet that burden is falling on the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project. This deserves further investigation, and there may be lots of reasons why. I've heard some really good explanations why, but that's a scary number, but it's probably not due to sea level rise. It hasn't risen that much in that period of time to account for that.
And I saw a question online. Feel free to ask your questions online, but we're going to go through the questions in the room first, and if there's time, we'll get to the online questions.
Can you talk a little bit about how you envision storage working for this water? You mentioned it a little bit, but if you don't have space in the reservoir, it's real hard to move it from year to year, season to season.
Right. So this is why the ecosystem water budget is an asset. It has to have a series of assets. So I could envision in a year like 2017 that basically there's trading going on, and that you're going to trade some of your ecosystem water for water in the future, and you're going to ask them to store it for you. Now there's all kinds of, as you know, complications in storage, because if it spills, you lose it. You know, those are the kinds of things that have to be agreed. But you know, you've got a big reservoir people are talking about building up here called sites. I'm sure you're familiar with it, that is supposed to provide public benefit. Well, the place to start with sites, if we do build sites, is to grant a portion of that storage to the ecosystem. I could easily see Shasta, for example, having a portion of its allocation assigned for ecosystem management, which could be flexible. Hey, we got a cool spring, things are pretty good, we can go ahead and trade some water, sell some water downstream. Or, hey, it's a bloody hot summer, we've got to hang on to that ecosystem water up there and release it later. That's the way they do it, by the way, in Australia, for example. They allocate a portion of that storage to the environment, and they're allowed, the environmental managers are allowed to actually manage that storage. Now, I can imagine if I were Yuba County Water Agency, I wouldn't like that idea at all, but that might be the trade-off for a little greater surety in the water supply budget side. So yeah, I think storage has to be key, but I want to give you an example. Let's take Yuba County. The water agency, you know, for example, they've got storage in that system. Of course, they have the large storage upstream, and they have groundwater as a part of that. And so what they do on the times where they have to leave water in the system, they move their farmers into groundwater. So imagine that the Tuolumne River, and I'm just picking on this because Randy's in the room, the Tuolumne River, which is actually a small enough group they could organize. I mean, the main entities, really three main entities that are here within it, they want to manage that budget, and that the environment is participating in the groundwater management in that basin, because they're basically doing either in lieu or they're actually involved in the recharge. And some of that ecosystem water gets put in storage into the ground. That's good for the local groundwater basin, by the way, for them to be involved in it. It's a clearly defined, I'm looking at Michael, I think it's a clearly defined beneficial use, because you're going to basically draw it out and use it in the river. I say that, but I'm always surprised when I say how in the nuts and bolts of that, how it works out. But you know, that might be one way to go. Again, they flexibly do this elsewhere. There's no reason we can't do it here. This is Randy now, for those who are not here.
Jeff, I'm reminded of 2015 when Merced only had enough water in storage to meet their minimum in-stream flow requirements, and they provided zero water to their customers, but they adhered to the requirement for minimum in-stream flows. At the same time, when other agencies around the state were petitioning for temporary change petitions, How does TUCPs fit into your modernized approach?
I could tell you we struggled with that one. The lame answer that I can give you is done right, you don't need them, right? I mean, that is if there's been good storage and trading and management of like a water right, you end up not needing a TUCP, but I can absolutely see in years like in 2014-15 where unforeseen events occur that you're going to probably have to have the TUCP process available to make this work. It's hard for me to imagine you wouldn't. You know, I worked at the University of California for 34 years where everything started with no, and then you worked from there. There has to be exceptions along the way. You can't be rigid on this. So we went round and around on this very question whether there would be TUCPs, because one argument is if we're setting these minimum in-stream flow standards, well, they're minimum in-stream flow standards, right? You can't go below them. That was the idea because of the biological harm that's associated with that. And so, but you still, I think it's given our uncertainties, it's unreasonable to state that that's a hard and fast bottom on it. But what I would like to see is that is the responsibility of the environment to manage that, so that the environment has that water. And the environment is basically the ecosystem trustee is the one that's delivering that water. And if they cannot, you hang them. But I mean, they're basically somebody's responsible for that, managing it like a water right.
You mentioned Australia. So for the trustees there, what kinds of organizations were the trustees?
So it turns out the way it worked in Victoria, for example, there was a single person who's really in charge of everything, and that's under the Environment Ministry. And they are in charge of all of it. But it turns out they also devolve it on a basin scale, so that it is managed at the basin scale. So there is somebody at the basin scale that's managed, but it is still one person is really in charge of the whole thing. They are the environmental water holder. They essentially, and that's a water right to them. And that's the equivalent of a water right to them. So yeah, it's one person.
And they coordinate it across basin through that one organization.
And all of this goes through that annual watering plan. So in the fall, in their fall, they are basically going through the hard discussions about what are our priorities for this year. And by the way, so let me give you another, sorry, when you go through a talk, you forget. One of the key things that we learned from looking at their approach is they're explicit about their priorities. And so they say if we run into the inability to meet all these needs, these are the ones we choose not to meet so that we can meet these. When you look back at our drought, that was absolute characteristic. We cannot meet cold water standards for winter run Chinook salmon, nor can we meet outflow standards for Delta smelt. Well, which one of these are we going to do? Very difficult, right? But we should have done that in advance, made those decisions in advance. They do that in advance. And everybody knows that that's what they're going to do in that coming year. Very painful, very difficult. That's why I like ecosystem-based approach.
Any other questions in the room? Otherwise, we'll have time for one question I saw online. Shatter QRA. Move this over here.
Well, you can read that.
Oh, okay. A lot of questions.
Damn it.
I'll read this. Can you better define uncaptured flows and what it would take to capture more of these flows in delta or up gradient?
Okay, so that was one of the dangers, which we avoided using the term surplus flow because that has a specific definition in Water Board's world, so we call it uncaptured flow. What we meant by that is flow within this system that exceeds the capacity, the physical capacity to divert, and I modified it later, but the physical capacity to divert it and use it for economic purposes. And so, for example, when the pumps are pumping full blast in the delta, and inflow exceeds the amount of water that's set aside for the environment, that remaining water is uncaptured flow, which produces multiple benefits. And then the argument would be you could come back to the board and presumably apply for that water. So let's imagine that we're going to build a bunch of big dams upstream and they want to basically use that uncaptured flow. In my view, that would be a mistake because that uncaptured flow creates direct benefit for the delta that we don't acknowledge, and that is by freshening the delta, it creates both environmental benefits as well as water supply benefits. This is one of the unfortunately not well realized issues. So when Kamyar and others get really going on this flood managed aquifer recharge issue and they're capturing all that water upstream, if it's a large volume of water, it's no longer uncaptured flow in the delta. So there is a consequence when we start trying to push more water into groundwater to outflow in the delta. And we right now don't really have a good mechanism for dealing with that and understanding that because it doesn't fall into the water rights system or neatly into the water rights system. That's a really good question.
And we are pretty much out of time, but I did see a question I can't resist asking, I think. How are we ever going to get a regulatory agency to take the risk you're talking about? And how are we going to convince senior water right holders to go along with this since they have to get less water?
Okay. Okay, so on the regulator side, I think I'll be very blunt about this. It's leadership, and that is the people who are in those regulatory agencies. It's not the person down there at the line level, but the leaders in those agencies who say, look, we think this is going to be a better way to go. You could do it legislatively. Probably would require federal as well as state legislation, but I think on the state legislative side you could do it. We certainly argue the state board has the authority to say this is the way we want it to be managed, so they have the power to do that. It's the willingness to take some risks, knowing full well you'll probably be sued because this is water. And for the senior water rights holder, what we're dangling in front of the senior water rights holders, we're talking about a budget that we're trying to get out of the business where we're constantly seeking in the future, the uncertainty of the future that we're going to come back. And the next time the board goes through a water quality control plan, which they're supposed to do every 3 years, by the way, there's not that which doesn't going to happen, but that there's going to continue to be another bite out of the apple. And so the argument is we're not going to do that. We're going to set this up, and you're going to benefit ultimately from that. And of course, I think that if you can engage this ecosystem water budgets and have them managed in the way of another water right holder in the basin, you end up starting to have a partner in it, a flexible partner, which would be really useful, especially if there's groundwater involved in it. So, again, until people see this on paper in some way, shape, or form, it remains in the abstract. And the place to start might be sites reservoir. It might be the first place to start about a true ecosystem water budget, or it might be in the water quality control plan, which is a little tougher nut to crack.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming.
Thanks.